So Mrs. Kowach here with our demonstration for today, which is the biscuit method. So the biscuit, when we're doing a biscuit or any type of flaky pastry and scone, the tool of choice is going to be the pastry blender, okay? So anytime you see a recipe that says we need to cut something in, we're using a pastry blender. So Kaylin had asked me a question yesterday, Mrs. K, if I don't have a pastry blender at home, is there anything else that I have at home that I could use to do the same thing as a pastry blender? And you could use 2 butter knives, right? So if you have a couple butter knives and you could cut the fat, maybe it's not as easier, it might take slightly longer, but it is possible to use that, okay? So our pastry blender. So can anybody tell me what the first step of the biscuit method is? To sift what? Sift all your dry ingredients. So first of all, my recipe calls for 250 mils of flour, which is 1 cup if you like imperial. I like to do the imperial method. Make sure that you are leveling because baking is very much a science and things need to be level. So I've got 1 cup of flour, 1 mil of salt, which is 1/4 teaspoon. If the lid wants to come off, we'll see. 1/4 salt. Salt is for flavor in a biscuit method. And then we've got baking powder. Baking powder is our leavening agent, and just as a review for me and for you, does baking powder have an acid in it?
Yes.
Yes. What is the name of the acid? Nope. It's cream of tartar or tartaric acid, which is, so it calls for 5 and I have a 1/2 mil, so I'm going to use 2 of these, or 1/2 teaspoon, so I'm going to use 2 1/2 teaspoons. That's fine. Just use what you have that's clean in your house, no problem. Be creative with your measuring. Where did my lid go? Okay, so cream of tartar, and tartaric acid is actually comes from the empty barrels of wine, and it's a residue that's on the interior of the barrels that's collected, put into little boxes, and then sold for about $10 a box, which is actually quite expensive. So our baking powder's in there. So being that baking powder has an acid in it, do we require an acid in the recipe for it to become activated?
No.
No. And baking powder, so I'm going to sift all of these together. Sifting adds air. Baking powder activates twice. Now we just did a theory page on baking powder. Baking powder activates once when you add in your liquids, and then it activates again to produce another puff of carbon dioxide when you put on heat, okay? Or expose it to heat. That means when we put it in the oven, it's going to puff up again, okay? So in here, I've got my sifted dry ingredients. Now I'm gonna, with the biscuit method, and something that specifically differs the biscuit method from the muffin method, is that we use as cold solid fat. The fat can be anything, but I suggest shortening. Butter has a very low melting point. Shortening shortens the gluten strands and has an extremely high melting point, which means it's going to give you a nice flaky biscuit and it's not going to burn as quickly, okay? Butter, because of the milk fat, a low melting point, it's going to burn a lot quicker, but on the other hand, butter tastes so much better. So I'm using shortening today. Now the key with biscuits and any type of pastry is that you keep all your ingredients cold, cold, and colder. So I'm going to use my pastry blender, and you want to cut your fat in until the little pieces of fat are about the size of a little green pea, okay? Or we call this, another way that they might call this in another recipe on the internet is like it resembles coarse crumbs, okay? I like to use the analogy of, you know, pea-sized chunks of fat. Now, by cutting the fat into the flour mixture, what we're doing is we're making those tiny little pea-sized pieces of fat, and we're coating each piece with flour, okay, or structure. Now when we put fat into the oven, the fat is going to melt away, but what will remain is very thin layers of flakiness, right, in a biscuit. And so that's what we're always looking for. You want your biscuit to be flaky. So the more layers you have, so if your biscuit's nice and tall and it has many, many flaky layers, each one of these little flaky layers represents fat that was rolled in flour. So the fat melted, but the structure of the flour stayed itself. Okay? So I'm gonna cut this in, I'm cutting it in. All right, so you guys see? Coarse crumbs, it looks pretty crumbly. Now, when I'm about to add liquids, sometimes my students make this choice, and it's a bad choice. You never add liquids in with your pastry blender, okay? Once you start adding liquids, you take away the pastry blender, and we're gonna move over to the good old fork. So the main difference between a muffin method and the biscuit method is the fat it uses. A true muffin method uses oil, a biscuit method uses solid cold fat. But something that's similar is that they both get tossed together using a fork, okay? And this one doesn't need to have a well, and we definitely sprinkle this in a little bit at a time, the liquids, okay? As opposed to the muffin method where we make a well and pour all of our liquids in at one time. So we're gonna toss this together until it comes together like a dough. There was also that Joy of Baking video that that lady, she demoed it quite well. Now keep in mind, if you wanted to jazz up a biscuit, you could add raisins. I know you guys love raisins. You can make it a savory biscuit. You could add fresh parsley, green onions, garlic powder, cheddar cheese. But you always want to add all of those things in the dry stage. So when after the flour's sifted, add those things, mix it in, and then cut in your fat. You don't want to add those things once you're adding liquids in, because they're not going to be evenly dispersed. And we call that even inclusion, right? I may just need a touch more milk. Oh, we have some over there. I'll grab some. Miss Estrada, the hero of the room, just helps me prepare all my labs during this COVID situation. Oh my gosh, I don't have my mask on. Oh my gosh, nobody told me. I forgot. I totally forgot, you guys. Nobody told me. I took it off to talk on the phone with a parent. I'm sorry. I apologize. You saw my face for the first time. My apologies. That was totally unintentional. COVID. And I was like, oh, gee whiz, I'm breathing so well right now. Yep. Back to suffocation. Okay. Totally didn't even notice that. You guys, next time I was talking on the phone with a couple parents. Next time if I forget it, make sure you're like, hey, Miss K, your mask. You can't just be like this. Sorry about that. Okay, so notice I pull. So if I'm pulling the parts that have come together and I see that there's parts at the bottom of my bowl that are still very floury and they are not very moist, just sprinkle a little bit of milk specifically on those areas, but not on the rest of the dough, just to kind of make it moist so it pulls it together. So now my dough is kind of coming together, and just as we're going to call her Barbara did in the video bridge, I just bring it together at the end with my hands. But why don't I want to like knead it really hard with my hands? Talk to me, Dax.
Over-mixing?
Over-mixing, and you're going to melt the fat with your warm hands, right? That's what I said when I was doing my little explanation earlier. Now, I like to have a little cup that I pull from, so you don't put your dirty hands in the bin. It's not hygienic. I'm going to pull from my cup. There we go. I'm taking my dough. I'm putting it just on my counter or turning it out on a floured surface. And then basically, I'm just going to bring it together. Now, it does not have to look smooth at all. In fact, it shouldn't. But the less you touch your dough with your hand, and this goes also when we're doing pastry, like for pies, the less you touch it, the better it is. And you know, if you're at home and you have time, it's always a good idea to kind of refrigerate it and then bring it back and roll it out so that you have the flakier biscuit or a flakier pastry. And that's what I would do at home. But I'm not at home. So today I'm going to show you two different methods. You can use a cookie cutter to cut out your biscuits, just like Barbara did. But let's say you don't have a cookie cutter at home and you don't want to waste biscuit, because sometimes when you use cookie cutter, you have to re-roll dough, waste biscuits, or it makes some of them a little bit more tough from the re-rolling of the pieces that are from the in-between. So I'm just going to cut off a little tiny piece here, and I can do the cookie cutter method. You could use the side of a metal spatula. That's safe. You can cut dough with that, or if you have a counter scraper, you could totally do that. So I'm going to just use this little piece here, do my little cookie cutter thing. Shane, may I have the use of your cookie cutter? Thank you. So then you don't want your biscuit to be super thin, okay? So then you cookie cut out your biscuit, and this is kind of the size. Whatever size you choose, make sure it's consistent, because if you have one that's too thick, one that's too thin, one that's bigger, one that's smaller, what will happen? Will they all bake evenly? No, some will be burnt, some will be raw, so make sure it's consistent size. And that, of course, goes with most things in baking. So now I want to show you just a different method. You can fold. There's so many methods I could show you for folding your dough. But I was thinking just this method. So if I'm at home, this is what I might do. For ease, Mrs. Strada was kind enough to actually bring us around the egg wash, which will make them nice and golden on top, which is great. If you have your biscuit dough, kind of form it into a circle, okay? This is what I would do. And then I would put the egg wash on, and if it was a sweet biscuit, I might even put some sugar or something on top, a little sprinkle of sugar, so you can try that if you want to. And then what I like to do is I like my biscuits to be little triangles instead of little cookie cutter circles. And then that way, we're getting no waste too, right? So what I'll do is I'll score my little triangles, and depending on how big your biscuit, like how big your dough is, your biscuit could be this big. Now I'm gonna cut them in quarters because that's what I have left. But I would egg wash first, put my sugar on, and then cut less. Because you don't want to put a bunch of sugar onto a cookie sheet or a bunch of egg wash with each one, because the residual will kind of drip in between and then be all over your cookie sheet, and then you'll have burnt sugar and the burnt smell of sugar, so it makes sense to do it on the counter and just transfer your finished pieces onto a cookie sheet. Does that make sense? All right, so then I'm just going to cut this. You guys can do the egg wash, I did not. Cut it this way, and if you want them to be even smaller, just cut them again, and they're like little tiny pie pieces. Now when you're placing your little tiny pie pieces on a cookie sheet, do you guys see how I'm placing them back there? You kind of do them alternately. So this is how I would cut a scone. So if you were doing something like the same biscuit method, except you were tossing in raisins, chocolate chips, white chocolate, you're making them a lot fancier, I'd cut them just like this, form a circle, cut triangles using a pizza wheel or a straight edge, egg wash them, put the sugar on top, and then this is exactly how I place them on the pan. And I really like that it reduces waste and uses every single piece of dough. All right, so then you alternately put them like that, and then that way, if you place them like this on a cookie sheet, you're gonna fit as many as you can on a single sheet. Does that make sense? Now, when we're checking biscuits for doneness, we're looking at the bottom, right? They will be golden on the top if there's an egg wash, but a quick bread, so muffins, biscuits, and cakes really need to be looked at the bottom. Are they golden brown on the bottom? We're good to go. Sound good? All right, thanks. Wait for another episode of Mrs. K for next time. I'll pop this one up on my Google Classroom so that anybody who wants to do it at home has these tips and tricks. I bet you